The first thing I want to do is stay stitch around the neckline. Using 6 to 8 stitches per inch, I'm stitching right within the 1/4 inch seam allowance, just a fraction under the 1/4 inch. And I'm stitching from the high shoulder to the center front neck. Leave a thread because I'm actually going to be pulling on these threads a little bit. Flipping over and stitching from the other shoulder to the center front neck. This way the fabric is pushed the same direction on either side. This neckline is real scoopy and round, so a lot of the grain is more bias and tends to stretch out, especially in this nice loosely woven linen with a batiste underneath it. So it stretches, the neckline will have stretched a little bit more than the pattern, and by using a basting or easing stitch, I can ease it back into shape. You can see the puckers. That's partly from cutting, it relaxes, and actually the stitching pushes it and makes it grow a little bit. But the stitching also enables me to pull it back into shape. So what I'm going to do is lay the fabric on top of the pattern. You can see it's a little bit shorter. It's puckered in and a little misshapen. So I'm going to pull this very gently. If you have a hard time getting a good thread, take a straight pin or needle and pull it out. I don't need it up at the shoulder area. I only need it in the scoopy area. And I'm gently gathering it in, and if I gather too much, I can pull it back out. I just want the final fabric to be the exact length of the pattern in the neckline. You can see on the right-hand side where I'm pulling now, up at the shoulder, it's a little bit longer, it's stretched. So we have to pull these back in. And when you pull them back in, make sure that the notches align around the neckline, as well as the whole body area is the same length as the pattern in the neck. And now with the side fronts, starting high to low, I'm going to stay stitch under the arm. This is just under a 1/4 inch. This complete seam allowance here is a 1/4 inch, but I'm just going to go a fraction less so that hopefully it won't show when the fabric is or the garment is completely sewn. But if it does, then you just pull it out. The bust area needs to be eased in, and so I'm first sewing at the 1/2 inch mark, again a basting thread or stitch, 6 to 8 stitches per inch. And that's again right under the seam line. And then about a 1/4 of an inch from the edge. And if you notice, I'm going a little past the notches. That's because when you gather, it doesn't gather immediately. So by going a little past the notches, when I pull those threads, the gathering should start where the notches are. And one last gathering thread at about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. And I'll repeat the process on the other side. But first, I want to note exactly where I started and stopped the stitching on the first piece that I stitched. And we'll put these pieces aside for a few minutes. I want to stay stitch under the arm on the 2 side back pieces. And also in the upper curve of the side back. This will not be eased in like the side front, but it still has a little bit of ease, just not quite as much. So again, testing to see the underarm has grown a little bit, so I'll pull that back into shape. Repeating the same process on the other side back. Stay stitching under the arm, just under 1/4 inch seam allowance. And running 1 basting stitch right under the seam allowance on the upper curve of the side back. And the reason I'm only doing 1 row is because it doesn't need to be gathered like the bust area does. This might have a tiny bit of easing, but very little. By stacking my two backs together with the interlining up, I'm going to mark the tip of that pen, tip of the dart with the pen, and just pull it right through the paper. Now at home, you can certainly do this with chalk if you like, but for teaching purposes, pencil's much better. So I'm actually going to mark the dart on both sides. I'm aligning the tip where the pen is with the notches at the top. And I'm also marking the bottom of the dart. Because there are two layers, the linen and the batiste, to sew a dart like this without basting the center, sometimes the two fabrics separate and the dart doesn't get sewn accurately through both layers. So what I'm doing here is with a long basting stitch, I'm connecting both fabrics together. That way, when I fold the fabrics right sides together to sew the dart, they're stabilized. I'm stay stitching around the back neckline. Checking to see if it's stretched out of shape. Repeating the same process on the other side of the center back piece. Stay stitching around the back piece armhole and also around the curve, not at center back, but at the side of this piece. Just on that curve. It will help when I put the garment together. Repeating the process on the other back piece. Stay stitching around the armhole, just inside the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And along the upper part of the curve. And then give it a little steam. It kind of helps set everything. And also, because of all the fibers of the linen and the cotton, when you start pressing it, it helps the two fabrics sort of adhere to each other. Now what I'm doing is aligning the notches at the back neck dart, pressing the dart down that hand-basted center. That helps stabilize it for sewing. Making sure that my notches align perfectly. Repeating the process on this back piece. Pressing the center, aligning the notches. Don't go past the tip of the dart with the iron, or you'll have a crease you don't want. And now to stitch these. Back tack just 1 or 2 stitches, and this is a normal stitch. This is about 10 to 12 stitches per inch, whatever you find is best for the fabric that you're using. And almost always I start at the top of the dart and go to the tip. Tie off the threads at the tip, and I never clip them all the way to the knot. I try to leave about 1/2 inch because sometimes they will come untied no matter how many knots you've made. I usually tie them 2 or 3 times. And if you have at least 1/2 inch, you can get tweezers and tie it again. Repeating the same process on the other side. And pressing this dart toward center back and on both sides. Always test your iron. If you're on a scrap piece of fabric, and if your iron makes your fabric shine, then use a press cloth. Take a piece of linen that has very smooth texture to it, preferably a lightweight linen or cotton. Wash it to get the sizing out, and then put it between the iron and your fabric. But for teaching purposes, it's much easier to see what I'm doing if I'm not using press cloth. And this particular iron is very good. The surface of it does not usually leave a mark. And I always test everything. taking my center front piece and right sides together with one of the side front pieces. I'm going to pin them together, aligning all the notches. And this is where you will see how a larger bust has to be manipulated into that center front piece, that big curve. I'm clipping the center front piece. It needs to be clipped a little bit. It's too tight. And pushing that curve to match the edges of the fabrics together. I'm going to cut the threads on the red side of the fabric, not the white side. The white side, the inside of the garment, is where I'm going to pull the threads. You can also tie off the threads on the red side if you'd like. I'm just cutting them. It won't hurt anything as long as I leave the ones on the outside that I can see. Those are the ones that I'll pull together. Matching the bottom two hem areas together. Pinning from the hem line up to the rounded bust area. And now you can see all that gathering. What I'm doing is starting at the hemline and working up to the notches below the bust line. You could start at the top on the gathering side where the gathering stitches are and work completely down. I'm doing this just so it's stabilized while I work with the gathers, but either way is perfectly fine. This will make sense in just a moment when I finish this seam and flip the fabric over. Now I've already run the gathering threads. I didn't need to pull them very much, but they're there if I need them while sewing. Sometimes I wait till I'm actually sewing the garment and then pull the threads. This is starting at the underarm and stitching at a 1/2 inch across the gathering stitches of the bust area. right in that full area of the bust, the apex area, I see that I really need to hand manipulate this. So I'm going to stitch it by hand and then go over it with the machine. When a person has a smaller bust, it's less challenging to sew this area because the curves are not so different from one piece to the other, the curves that adjoin. For instance, the front of the body to the side front, where the apex is. And now that I've stabilized it with hand stitching, I can go over it with the machine. And you notice I'm kind of cupping the fabric up. You learn to handle these fabrics to feed it through the machine so that it doesn't bunch up and create little pleats. And rather than back tack over my old stitching, I just overlap for quite a few stitches. Pinning from the hemline up the body, matching the notches. Clipping the threads on the fashion fabric side, leaving the threads on the white cotton side. Clipping the gentle curve on the center front piece. That helps it not stretch, but give a little bit so that I can work all of the side front bust area into it. And having learned my lesson on the other side, I'm just going to baste this bust area. It'll make sewing it so much simpler. That way you can also take the pins out when you sew if you choose to. You want to make sure not to sew over pins. It can break your needle, and even if the needle just hits it, it will create a burr in the needle and damage your fabrics. Again, I'm starting at the hemline, and probably because I feel like in this case, in this particular piece, I can get a smoother seam. Also, if I flip the fabric over, I'd have the body under the sewing machine. It would be in my way. This way you can see the seam more clearly. And this one will go straight up the gathering stitches. It's a good idea before you start sewing a garment to run several bobbins so that when you run out of bobbin, you have one ready to reload and it doesn't slow you down too much. Since I ran out of bobbin and didn't realize it and had to resew the whole seam, I'm really glad I had already hand basted the bust line area. That keeps me from having to repin the whole thing. I'm embedding the stitches by pressing the seam flat with a little steam, being careful not to press the gathered area around the bust line. In other words, you don't want to smash it where the puckers are. That'll be pressed over a ham. Sometimes these seams that go down the bust are pressed open, sometimes to the side. So you have to decide which is better for the fabric, if it creates puckers if you press it open, or if it looks better if you press it to the side. And sometimes you really don't know till you see it on the model. Then you can press it the other direction if it doesn't work. Now I'm pulling these gathering stitches because this side bust piece, the seam sticks out a lot, and by pulling them, I can make that seam lay a little flatter. We'll learn a lot more about gathering when we get to skirts. In this case, because it doesn't look gathered from the outside of the garment in the bust, I would call this easing rather than gathering. But it's still basically the same type of stitch and process. You see how that upper seam is puckery. By pulling those threads, I can make it lay flatter. And I'm pulling the top thread, the one closest to the edge. Because I don't want to pull the seam tighter, just the puckering. I did not stay stitch the armhole area of the center front piece, so I'll do that now. Stay stitching right under the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now what I want to do is stabilize the two fabrics together along the center back seam. I have 3/4 of an inch here for seam allowance, and I'm marking it with a pencil, and then I'll baste it just like I did the shoulder darts at the back. This way, when I put the zipper in and sew the seam down the center back, everything will stick together. The two layers of fabric will remain together and one won't float over the other. With a single thread, I'm basting with long basting stitches right through the pencil line that I drew, 3/4 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. And you'll be able to see this very clearly when I flip the fabric over to the red side. Now I've aligned this back two pieces with the side backs, right sides together. Start at either end. I'm starting at the hemline, and I'll match the notches all the way up to the underarm area. The piece on top is the side back. Right at that waist area, if it's too tight, you can clip it. And now with a regular stitch, 10 to 12 stitches per inch or whatever works for your fabric best, I'm going to stitch the side back to the back. These are 1/2 inch seam allowances. I had to tighten the stitch. I hadn't tightened it back to a normal stitch. It was still on basting. Notice I'm giving the fabric a little tension on either side of the needle, just enough that it helps the fabric feed through the machine and remain flat and not curl up or bunch up. Repeating the same process on the other side. And I usually stitch so that most of the fabric is laying to the left and not bunched under the arm of the sewing machine. It would be very hard for you to see it, and it gets in the way. So that sometimes determines the direction that I stitch. And now to embed the stitches, and I'm doing it with the curve up. That'll help me not smash any easing in there to be sure that I don't create any creases that I don't want. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on the fabric with the iron so as not to make an impression from the seam allowances. The better you are able to press garments as you sew them, the more efficient you become with that, the better quality you have with that, the better quality the final garment will be. And now to stitch the underarms, the side seams, This is a 3/4 inch seam allowance, but whatever you have is fine. I would not make this seam allowance very small. I would say no less than 1/2 inch. One of the beauties of making custom clothing is that you can add wider seam allowance in side seams and backs, not usually over the bust area. And that way, if the client changes weight and shape, which often happens, you can adjust the garment accordingly. Embedding the stitches with steam. And linen and cotton can take fairly high heat. and pressing the seams open. And now for the shoulders. I'm starting at the high point where the neck is and working out to the shoulder tip area. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Repeating the same thing on the other shoulder seam.